In the summer of 1945, when the Pacific War was grinding toward its final terrible conclusion, America's Essex-Class aircraft carriers stood as the most powerful instruments of naval warfare the world had ever seen. They were fast, they were armored in purpose, if not in plate, and they carried within their steel hulls the concentrated violence of an industrial civilization at the absolute peak of its wartime production. 24 of them had been completed since the first USS Essex herself was commissioned in December of 1942. They had crossed every longitude of the Pacific. They had buried their dead in waters that bore no markers. They had launched thousands of aircraft against an enemy that fought with the particular ferocity of a nation that knew, by the end, that it was losing. But what happened next? Almost no one remembers. The carriers did not vanish in battle. That would have been, in some perverse way, a cleaner ending, a conclusion commensurate with the scale of what they had done. Instead, they survived. And survival, for a warship built for a war that had just ended, carried its own peculiar weight. The world into which they returned in the autumn of 1945 was a world that no longer needed them in the way they had been needed. The atomic bomb had been dropped twice. The ceremonies of surrender had been signed on the deck of a battleship in Tokyo Bay. The logic of conventional naval warfare, the massed carrier strike, the thousands of sorties, the coordinated fleet action across hundreds of miles of open ocean had been complicated, perhaps permanently, by weapons that could do in a single moment what a fleet could not accomplish in a week. And yet, there they were, 24 of the finest warships ever built, returning to American ports in a country that was already in that swift and unsentimental way of democracies after wars, beginning to forget the cost at which they had been constructed. The crowds that came to the docks to welcome home, the men were not there to honor the ships. The ships were simply the vessels that had delivered the living back to shore. What would become of the steel itself, of the flight decks and the catapults and the arresting wires and the hangar bays built for a world that had just ceased to exist, was a question that no one in the jubilation of that first autumn of peace had fully thought through. This is the story of what happened when the question was finally answered. It is a story of mothballs and rust, of bureaucratic indecision and strategic reinvention, of engineers who looked at a wartime hull and saw in it, against all conventional wisdom, the bones of something that might yet be made to serve a faster, colder, more nuclear age. It is, in the end, a story about survival, not the glorious kind, the grinding, compromised, improbable kind that leaves its marks on steel and men alike. The immediate aftermath of the war was not preservation, it was confusion, and then, as the scale of what had to be done became clear, it was reduction. The United States Navy in 1945 was the largest naval force in the history of the world. It comprised thousands of vessels of every class, from fleet carriers to landing craft, crewed by millions of men who wanted nothing more than to go home. The political pressure to demobilize was immense and almost irresistible. Congress, reflecting the exhaustion and relief of the electorate, moved swiftly to cut the defense budget. Ships that had cost years of industrial effort and the labor of hundreds of thousands of workers were suddenly inconvenient facts in a peacetime ledger. The Essex-Class carriers were too large, too expensive, and too complex to simply be run aground and abandoned. They could not be scrapped cheaply or quickly. Each one represented an investment in specialized machinery and structural engineering that made routine destruction impractical in the short term. The decision was made to place most of them in reserve. The Navy had a category for this: the inactive reserve fleet, colloquially known as the mothball fleet. Ships placed in this status were systematically dehumidified, their machinery coated and sealed, their openings closed against the corrosive air of coastal harbors. They were tied up in long rows in protected anchorages, at Bremerton in Washington, at Bayonne in New Jersey, at Philadelphia, and left to wait for a future that had not yet been imagined. There is something almost unbearable in that image. Ships that had been alive with the controlled chaos of wartime operations, the roar of aircraft engines, the smell of aviation fuel, the constant human motion of crews numbering 2,000 to 3,000 men, reduced to silence. The flight decks on which pilots had landed in the dark, half dead from exhaustion and fear, were now bare and still. The hangar bays where mechanics had worked around the clock were empty. The island structures from which admirals had watched battles unfold now watched nothing but the slow passage of seasons over Gray Harbor water. Not all 24 entered reserve immediately. Some continued active service into the late 1940s as the Navy struggled to maintain at least a working fleet while the debates over budgets and strategy consumed Washington. But the trajectory was clear. By the end of the decade, the great majority of the Essex-Class hulls were in various stages of reduced readiness, their fates officially undecided, their maintenance cost a recurring irritant in naval appropriations hearings. The war was over. The carriers had served their purpose. The question was whether they had a purpose left. It was a question the world would force the Navy to answer sooner than anyone expected. The Korean War began in June of 1950. And it arrived like a cold instruction from history to a Navy that had perhaps begun to believe its own post-war rhetoric about obsolescence and diminishment. The communist forces of North Korea crossed the 38th parallel and drove southward with a speed that stunned Washington. The United States, committed by treaty and by the logic of its Cold War policy to the defense of South Korea, found itself scrambling to respond. And what it found when it reached into the reserves was that the mothballed carriers were still there, still sealed, still waiting. The reactivations that followed were not elegant. Years in reserve had taken their toll on equipment and on the institutional knowledge required to operate complex systems, but the hulls themselves were sound. The Essex-Class had been built to a standard of structural integrity that the post-war years had not meaningfully degraded. Ships that had been tied to a pier in Bremerton for 4 years could be brought back to something approaching operational readiness in a matter of months, given sufficient men and money and urgency. Korea provided all three. Several Essex-Class carriers deployed to Korean waters between 1950 and 1953, operating as part of Task Force 77, the carrier striking force of the 7th Fleet. They flew strikes against North Korean supply lines and troop concentrations, operating in the cold waters of the Yellow Sea and the Sea of Japan, under conditions that were entirely different from the Pacific War, yet demanded the same fundamental things from the ships and their crews: reliability, endurance, the capacity to sustain continuous air operations for days without respite. The carriers provided them. But Korea also made something else clear. The aircraft that flew from Essex-Class decks in 1950 and 1951 were already in transition. The first generation of carrier-based jets, the F-9F Panther, the F-2H Banshee, were fundamentally different from the propeller-driven aircraft for which the ships had been designed. They were heavier. They needed more deck run to take off. They landed faster and hit the arresting wires with more force. The flight decks and catapults of a ship designed in the early 1940s were not ideally suited to the machines of 1950, and the machines of 1950 were already being replaced by faster, heavier aircraft that would stress the ship's systems even further. The Essex-Class carriers had demonstrated their continued relevance, but they had also revealed the terms on which that relevance would have to be purchased, through transformation, not merely through reactivation. The two modernization programs that would define the second life of the Essex-Class were designated SCB-27 and SCB-125. SCB stood for Ship Characteristics Board, the naval body responsible for defining the parameters of ship construction and modification. The numbers were bureaucratic codes. What they represented in practice was a fundamental reimagining of what a carrier could be. A recognition that the Essex hull, sound and spacious as it was, could serve as the foundation for a ship capable of operating the next generation of naval aircraft if enough of its internal and external systems were replaced. SCB-27 was approved in 1947, and the first conversions began shortly thereafter, initially at a cautious pace constrained by post-war budgets, then accelerating as Korea demonstrated the continued necessity of carrier aviation. The program involved replacing the original catapults with more powerful hydraulic units capable of launching heavier aircraft, strengthening the flight deck and arresting gear, enlarging and reinforcing the hangar deck, improving the aviation fuel and ordnance handling systems, and, critically, replacing the original open bow configuration with an enclosed hurricane bow that better suited the ship for high-speed operations in North Atlantic and North Pacific conditions. The island structure was modified. Fire suppression systems were upgraded. The anti-aircraft battery, which in the wartime configuration had bristled with 40mm and 20mm guns in sufficient numbers to occupy a substantial fraction of the crew, was reduced and modernized as guided missiles began to offer an alternative to massed automatic cannon fire. SCB-125 came later and addressed what had become by the early 1950s the central problem of carrier aviation, the angled flight deck. The angled deck was a British invention first tested in 1952, and it solved with elegant simplicity a problem that had bedeviled carrier operations since the first aircraft landed on a moving ship. On a straight-deck carrier, a landing aircraft that missed all the arresting wires, a bolter, in the terminology of naval aviation, had only the crash barrier between it and the aircraft parked forward on the flight deck. On an angled deck, the landing area was offset several degrees from the ship's centerline. A bolter could simply apply power and fly off the angled deck clear of the ship, then enter the landing pattern again. It transformed the safety mathematics of carrier aviation and simultaneously allowed launching and landing operations to proceed simultaneously, a tactical advantage of considerable significance. The Essex-Class ships rebuilt under SCB-125 received the angled deck as their most visible modification. They also received an enclosed hurricane bow if they had not already received one under SCB-27, and an updated mirror landing system in place of the older batsman-controlled approach. When these ships returned to the fleet after their conversions, which could take 2 years or more and represented expenditures running into the tens of millions of dollars, they were substantially different ships from the ones that had gone into the yards. Same hull, same name, but different in almost every way that mattered operationally from the vessel that had fought at Philippine Sea or Leyte Gulf. There is a philosophical question buried in all of this, one that the admirals and engineers probably did not pause to consider as they made their decisions about displacement limits and catapult specifications and angled deck geometry. It is the question of identity. When enough of a ship has been replaced, when the catapults and the deck and the bow and the island and the aviation systems are all new, when the crew who served in the original is long gone, and the institutional memory of the wartime service has been replaced by the accumulated experience of a different kind of war and a different kind of flying. Is it still the same ship? The name remains. The hull numbers remain painted on the bows. But the thing that bore those names and numbers has been so thoroughly reconstructed that the connection to the 1942 or 1943 original is more genealogical than material. This is not merely an abstract question. It shaped how the modernized Essex-Class carriers were perceived by the men who served in them and by the Navy that operated them. The veterans who had fought from these ships in the Pacific War did not always recognize what the conversions had produced. The flight decks they had known, the straight, uninterrupted expanse of teak and steel from which Hellcats and Avengers had launched into Pacific dawns, were now angled and elongated and crisscrossed with the heavier gear of the jet age. The island structures that had housed familiar equipment and familiar faces bore the antennae and fittings of a different technological era. The hangar bays that had been packed with propeller-driven aircraft were now configured for machines whose engine noise was a different register of violence entirely. And yet, the hulls persisted. Whatever the modifications, the fundamental geometry of the Essex-Class, the length, the beam, the depth of the hull, the structural members that distributed the enormous dynamic loads of continuous flight operations, remained as the engineers of the early 1940s had designed them. This was not accident. It was the product of a design philosophy that had, perhaps unknowingly, built-in margins of strength and adaptability that would prove their value only decades after the ships were commissioned. The Essex-Class carriers were designed for one war and one generation of aircraft. They served 3 more decades and several technological revolutions because the men who drew their lines had, for reasons that had nothing to do with the jet age or the angled deck or the space program, built them strong enough to survive transformation. That was the essential irony of the Essex-Class story. Ships built to project force had to be unmade in significant measure before they could do so again. The wartime configuration was not the final configuration. The final configuration, the angled deck, the enclosed bow, the jet-rated catapults, was the product of a process of deliberate destruction and reconstruction that was, in its way, as demanding and costly as the original construction had been. The second life of the Essex-Class carriers extended across the full arc of the Cold War's most dangerous decades. Through the mid-1950s and the 1960s, the rebuilt ships served as the primary striking platforms of American carrier aviation, operating in the Mediterranean with the 6th Fleet, in the Western Pacific with the 7th Fleet, and in the Atlantic and Caribbean as the Navy refined its responses to Soviet naval and aerial expansion. They carried successive generations of aircraft. The F-2H Banshee and F-9F Panther gave way to the F-3H Demon and the F-8U Crusader and the A-4D Skyhawk, each new aircraft faster and heavier than the last, each generation testing the limits of what the rebuilt ships could accommodate and sustain. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 brought Essex-Class carriers directly into what may have been the single most dangerous moment in the history of the Cold War. USS Essex herself, the named ship of the class, the first of the 24, served as the flagship of the naval quarantine force that surrounded Cuba during those 13 days when the world held its breath. Her aircraft tracked Soviet submarines. Her helicopters flew the communications runs that kept the blockade coordinated. She was, in that moment, a direct instrument of the most consequential act of coercive naval power in the post-war era, deployed in defense of a policy whose failure could have ended civilization. And then there was Vietnam. The Essex-Class carriers that deployed to Yankee Station in the Gulf of Tonkin in the 1960s carried the war to North Vietnam in a campaign of sustained air bombardment that lasted, with interruptions, for nearly a decade. The missions flown from those decks, the rolling thunder strikes against bridges and rail yards and petroleum storage facilities, the more dangerous strikes against the surface-to-air missile sites that ringed Hanoi, the close air support missions in the south, were conducted in conditions of sustained intensity that the wartime designers could not have anticipated and that tested every system the rebuilds had installed. Aircraft were lost. Aviators were killed or captured. The ships themselves endured. The Essex-Class ships that fought in Vietnam were, by that point, more than 20 years old in their hulls, though younger in most of their systems. They were aging machinery operated by young men in a war that was dividing the country that had built them. There was a particular melancholy in this, in the spectacle of ships forged in the total war of 1943 and 1944, rebuilt for the jet age of the 1950s, now flying sorties in a limited war that the nation was losing in ways that had nothing to do with aircraft or carriers or the courage of the men who flew from them. The carriers performed their function. The function, as it turned out, was not enough. The space program gave the Essex-Class carriers one more role, one entirely different from anything their designers or even their rebuilders had contemplated. Beginning with Project Mercury in the early 1960s, NASA required ships capable of recovering astronauts and their capsules from open ocean within a reasonable time after splashdown in conditions that could range from calm to dangerously rough. Carrier flight decks were ideal helicopter platforms. Carrier crews included the medical personnel and the technical staff needed to handle the capsules and their occupants. Carrier communication suites could coordinate with mission control. And so the same ships that had fought in the Pacific and Korea and were then fighting in Vietnam found themselves at the center of the American space program, stationed in the Pacific or Atlantic recovery zones, watching the sky for the parachutes of returning astronauts. USS Essex recovered the first American in space, or rather the capsule that had carried the first American in space, Alan Shepard's Freedom 7, in May of 1961. USS Kearsarge recovered John Glenn after his orbital flight in February of 1962, the mission that had made Glenn a national hero and the space program a point of pride for a country anxious about Soviet technological leadership. USS Hornet, the third ship to bear that name, laid down in 1943 and commissioned in 1943, rebuilt under SCB-27A and SCB-125, recovered the crew of Apollo 11 in July of 1969, the men who had walked on the moon, and then recovered the crew of Apollo 12 4 months later. USS Yorktown, the third Yorktown, named for the second which had been sunk at Midway in 1942, recovered the crew of Apollo 8, the first humans to orbit the moon. These were not trivial assignments handed to obsolescent ships. They were, in their way, the most historically significant events in which any ship had ever participated. The men brought back from the moon were returned to civilization aboard the flight decks of Essex-Class carriers. The carriers that had helped win the Pacific War and had been rebuilt to fly jets in the Cold War ended in some cases as the first solid ground, or the first solid steel, that the men who had gone farthest from the Earth ever touched on their return. It was a role that no one had planned for when the ships were designed, and it was, in some respects, the most remarkable chapter in their long and improbable careers, but it was also, unmistakably, a terminal role. Ships that recover astronauts are not ships that are expected to fight. The assignment was an honor, but it was also a kind of symbolic valediction, a recognition that the Essex-Class carriers, still useful, still capable of specific and important functions, had passed beyond the primary mission for which they had been most recently rebuilt. The supercarriers were coming, and the future belonged to them. The supercarriers had been coming for a long time. USS Forrestal, commissioned in October of 1955, was the first of the new generation, a ship so much larger than the Essex-Class that the comparison made the older vessels seem, by contrast, modest. Forrestal displaced nearly 80,000 tons fully loaded against the Essex-Class figure of roughly 45,000 tons in their rebuilt configuration. She could carry nearly twice as many aircraft. Her catapults were more powerful. Her fuel and ordnance capacity was larger. She was, in almost every measurable dimension of carrier capability, a more capable ship than the most thoroughly modernized Essex-Class vessel could aspire to be. Forrestal was followed by Ranger, Saratoga, Independence, and then by the nuclear-powered USS Enterprise, commissioned in November of 1961, which carried 8 reactors and could steam for years without refueling. The logic of the new carriers was simple and brutal. They could do more. They could do it faster. They could sustain operations for longer. As the Navy's budget was reorganized around the supercarrier concept, the Essex-Class ships that had been rebuilt at such cost in the late 1940s and 1950s began to seem like expensive commitments to a fading paradigm. The retirements began in earnest in the late 1960s and accelerated through the 1970s. The pattern was not uniform. Some ships were retired quickly, decommissioned and placed in reserve, then transferred to the mothball fleet they had left a decade or two before. Others were converted to alternative roles, anti-submarine warfare carriers, redesignated CVS rather than CV or CVA, operating helicopters and fixed-wing anti-submarine aircraft in the demanding task of hunting Soviet submarines in the Atlantic and Pacific. This conversion extended the service lives of several ships by a decade or more, though at the cost of their identity as strike carriers. A ship redesignated as an ASW platform was no longer, in any meaningful sense, the offensive instrument that had struck Japanese airfields at Formosa or hauled fighter bombers over North Vietnam. It was a different ship doing a different job in the hull of the old one. And then, one by one, the ASW conversions themselves aged out. The aircraft designed for anti-submarine warfare from Essex-Class decks were retired. The ships that operated them became too costly to maintain for roles that newer or more specialized vessels could fill. The retirements came again, steadily, through the middle and late 1970s. By 1991, the last Essex-Class carrier in active service, USS Lexington, redesignated as a training carrier and operating from Pensacola for decades, training generations of naval aviators in the basic mechanics of carrier landing, was decommissioned. The class was gone from the active fleet. 50 years after the first of them was commissioned, the last of them had been stood down. What happened to the hulls was the final chapter, and it was, for the most part, the chapter of the salvage yard. The economics of warship scrapping are not sentimental. A carrier hull contains thousands of tons of high-quality steel, copper wiring, machinery, and specialized equipment that retains its material value long after its operational value has expired. The cost of maintaining a decommissioned carrier in preservation, even in minimal preservation against the corrosive effects of salt air and neglect, is substantial and recurring. Without dedicated funding, without an institutional commitment to the ship's historical significance, the practical outcome was almost always the same. The ship was sold to a scrapping contractor, usually by competitive bid, and towed to a facility where it was cut apart methodically, its materials recovered for resale. Most of the Essex-Class carriers ended this way. not all at once, and not without, in some cases, protracted negotiations between naval authorities and the various organizations, veterans groups, maritime museums, local governments, that periodically attempted to save one ship or another. The negotiations were rarely successful. The cost of acquiring and maintaining a carrier as a museum ship was, and remains, genuinely prohibitive. A full-sized carrier requires structural maintenance, pier facilities, liability insurance, trained staff, and a steady stream of visitors sufficient to generate revenue against those costs. Many proposals to save individual ships foundered on one or more of these requirements. The ships were towed to the yards and cut apart. The ships that escaped this fate were few, and in their survival owe something to accidents of geography, timing, and institutional commitment that their sister ships did not enjoy. USS Intrepid, commissioned in August of 1943 and rebuilt under SCB-27A and SCB-125, survived decades of decommissioning and near scrapping to become the Intrepid Sea Air and Space Museum on the Hudson River in New York, where she has sat since 1982. USS Yorktown, the third of that name, became the centerpiece of the Patriots Point Naval and Maritime Museum in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, accessible from Charleston across the Cooper River. USS Hornet, the Apollo recovery ship, became the USS Hornet Sea Air and Space Museum at Alameda, California, in the former Naval Air Station from which her wartime predecessors had operated. USS Lexington became a museum ship at Corpus Christi, Texas, where she was moored in 1992, the year after her final decommissioning, and remains accessible today. 4 ships out of 24, 17%. The rest were scrapped. The steel went back into the economy. The names survived, in some cases transferred to later ships. New carriers bearing the names Essex, Oriskany, Bon Homme Richard, Shangri-La. But the hulls themselves, the specific accumulations of metal and weld and machinery that had fought in the Pacific and Korea and Vietnam, were gone. The archive of steel was mostly lost. What remains is what was saved. There is a temptation, when recounting a history like this one, to conclude with a lesson, to find in the arc of the Essex-Class carriers a moral that justifies the telling. But the story resists that kind of closure. The carriers were not saved by wisdom or by gratitude. The ones that survived did so largely by chance and by the particular energy of individuals and organizations who cared enough at the right moment to fight for them. The ones that were scrapped were not lost through negligence or indifference alone. They were lost because the economic reality of preservation is genuinely harsh, and because the human impulse to honor what has served us tends to be strongest when the service is recent and the cost is someone else's. What the Essex-Class carriers represent in their totality is something more complicated than triumph or tragedy. They were built for a war that ended, and they survived that ending. They were rebuilt for an age they had not been designed for, and they served it faithfully. They recovered men from the moon. They escorted the quarantine of Cuba. They flew across the Gulf of Tonkin for years on end in a war that history has not judged kindly. They trained thousands of naval aviators. They outlasted every prediction of their obsolescence, then finally succumbed not to enemy action or to structural failure, but to the simple arithmetic of a world that had moved on to larger, faster, more expensive ships. Most of them are gone. The 4 that remain are aging steel on urban waterfronts, maintained against time by foundations and volunteers, and the steady flow of visitors who come, often without knowing quite why, to stand on the flight decks and look out at the water. On a clear day, from the deck of the Intrepid on the Hudson, you can see the skyline of Manhattan. On a clear day, from the Yorktown at Patriots Point, you can see the mouth of Charleston Harbor. The ships that remain are geographical facts now as much as historical ones. Fixed points in coastal cities, their operational lives long over, their material lives continuing in the slow metabolism of preservation and rust and repair that is the fate of everything saved from oblivion. The ships that were scrapped left nothing visible. Their steel became other things. Buildings, machines, ships of later generations that bore no memory of what they had once been. The materials survived. The specific history encoded in each hull did not. This is the nature of the archive that steel makes. It records nothing of its own. The record must be made by other means. in other materials, by people who understood what was being lost and chose, against the pressure of economics and indifference and the simple passage of time, to insist that it mattered. 24 Essex-Class carriers were completed. 4 survive. The other 20 are everywhere and nowhere, in the steel of bridges and buildings and ships whose names have no connection to the Pacific, dispersed into the infrastructure of a civilization that has largely forgotten the particular cost at which its post-war prosperity was purchased. They were the wartime giants who had to be remade to survive the peace. Most of them were remade and served, and were then unmade a final time into raw material. A few were saved. This was their story. Remember it. If the fate of the Essex-Class carriers leaves you wanting to know what happened to another American war machine that served, was forgotten, and almost vanished entirely. What happened to the last battleships the United States Navy ever built? The Iowa-class giants that outlasted every prediction by half a century, then stay with lost war machines. That story is next.